Welcome everyone to the seventh Horizon 3 Biotech Investing webinar for 2021, hosted by Horizon 3 Biotech Fund and sponsored and conducted by FB Rights and Monsoon Communications. As you probably just heard, this webinar is being recorded and you've all seen the disclaimer upon registration. Today, we're very fortunate to have three experienced biotech sector executives: Dr. John Melke, CEO of Genetic Signatures; Michael Woods, Principal of Newbury Port Partners; and Dr. Paul Gavin, CEO of Avecho Biotechnology. And I should declare that Avecho is a portfolio company of the Horizon 3 Biotech Fund. Introduce you to the three panelists. Dr. John Melke has broad laboratory and business management experience. John joined Genetic Signatures in 2003 and since then has commercialised 4 research-based products and 7 diagnostic products and instruments. His previous research includes DNA methylation and epigenetics, microarray technologies, real-time PCR, and biological software evaluation. And in 2001, he was the recipient of the Sydney University Department of Medicine's Peter Bancroft Prize. John has led the product development team as Senior Principal Research Scientist since 2003 and has led the company as CEO for the last 10 years. I know it's been a very eventful and successful 10 years, John, so we look forward to hearing about that. Michael Wood has a unique blend of commercialisation, strategy development, project management, financial discipline, and investment banking experience gained through 20 years of experience in corporate finance, infrastructure project financing, private equity, medical technology commercialisation, and non-executive board roles around the world. So we look forward to hearing Michael's perspective as well. And last but not least, Dr. Paul Gavin joined Avecho almost 20 years ago and is one of the inventors of the Avecho TPM, which Paul will explain later, platform technology for transdermal delivery of drugs, and has managed its evolution from discovery to clinical with a range of products, CBD being the most recent of which we will hear about. Paul holds a BSc with honours and PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from Monash University. He is experienced in many aspects of R&D and has published a number of articles in peer-reviewed journals. So welcome, Paul. Today, I don't want people getting put off by this, but there's no other way of saying it. It's quite technical. Today, we'll be discussing the use of bisulfate method used for distinguishing methylated cysteine residues and unmethylated cysteine residues in DNA. John will explain all that, which is behind the proprietary 3-base sequence technology that drives Genetic Signatures' Easy Screen products. Also, Avecho's TPM drug delivery platform, combining a proprietary combination of 2 different forms of vitamin E that enhances drug solubility, stability, and bioavailability, with particular emphasis on CBD, cannabidiol delivery. Plus, we'll explore the biotech sector and investment trends and what to look out for in the rest of 2021. So to the audience, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen anytime, and we'll address as many of these as possible after we answer the pre-submitted question. First, we'll have Matt on the Horizon, where I comment on some of the important developments locally and internationally impacting our sector and thus investment objectives. In local news, Imugene says its phase 2 trial of Hervax for HER2 positive gastric cancer did not meet statistical significance or the secondary efficacy endpoint of progression-free survival. Imugene said that data showed a p-value of 0.266 for Hervax with standard of care chemotherapy compared to the standard of care chemotherapy alone arm. In international news, for years, top pharma companies responded to pricing criticism by pledging to limit their increases. After Allergan CEO Brett Saunders proposed keeping annual price hikes under 10% amid sharp drug pricing scrutiny, many companies followed suit. But now it appears some big players, specifically Merck and Amgen, are starting to test the limit of pharma's social contract by raising prices year on year by more than 10%. Elizabeth Holmes' fraud trial begins. More than 3 years after Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Sunny Balwani were indicted for a federal grand jury by a federal grand jury for their efforts to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to develop and distribute blood testing technology that didn't exist. Holmes's trial has finally begun. Holmes and Balwani, the CEO and Chief Operating Officer, respectively, of defunct diagnostic startup Theranos, faced 9 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The charges carry a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison and fines of $250,000 plus restitution for each of the 11 counts. Someone legal can tell me that's restitution, then they have to pay it all back. Both have pleaded not guilty to all charges. And in FDA news, 2 key vaccine leaders will leave the FDA this fall, just as the agency faces key decisions over COVID-19 booster shots and as variants take a bite out of the shot's efficacy. FDA Office of Vaccine Research and Review Director Marion Gruber and Deputy Director Philip Krauts will depart the agency. Both have been with the agency for decades and have been pivotal in the United States effort to authorize COVID-19 vaccines to fight the pandemic. And the chances of AstraZeneca's $39 billion bet on Alexion paying off just ticked up a notch. ALXN 1840, a drug Alexion has hailed as a potential blockbuster, has hit the primary endpoint in a phase 3 rare disease trial, clearing the path for a regulatory filing. Alexion picked up ALX in 1840 in its $855 million takeover of Wilson Therapeutics as part of a push by CEO Ludwig Hansen to rebuild the pipeline after earlier R&D missteps left the company unprepared for a forecasted downturn in sales of Soliris. After buying the asset, Alexion began a phase 3 clinical trial designed to show superiority over standard of care in Wilson disease. And the rapid unraveling of Sesen Bio goes on. 2 weeks ago, the biotech was on the cusp of winning FDA approval for cancer drug Vicinium and working its way towards authorization in Europe. Now, with the FDA rejecting Vicinium days before a media report of misconduct, Sesen has pulled its filing to the European Medicines Agency. And finally, in case you missed it, last week the FDA approved Pfizer's Comirnaty COVID vaccine, which must be a relief to recipients of that vaccine. And I might ask the panel right now, are we fully vaccinated? I am.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Well, at least, because it's interesting. People I meet that haven't had their vaccine thus far have said it's not FDA approved, and there's no come back to that. That's a fair skepticism. So it's good to see that the Pfizer one has been approved.
Yeah, I think it's helpful.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to our panelists now, and John, if I can start with you. For anyone not familiar with genetic technology's 3-base technique, can you briefly describe it and its applications?
Yeah, sure, Matt. Look, first of all, thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to the chat. Let me start with the application first. The technology is designed to make it easier to detect and identify microorganisms that cause infectious diseases. So these are the bugs that make us sick. It's done via the sale of consumable tests that we sell to hospitals and pathology labs. So 3-base is the name that's given to our platform technology. We've been developing this for over 15 years now. The technology is unique to genetic signatures. It was developed here in Australia. We're very proud of it. It is a molecular technology, and that means we directly detect the genetic information of the organisms that we're trying to detect. So that's directly their genetic information. So molecular means it's quite rapid. Results are in hours, not days, that some traditional methods can take. But in terms of what 3-base is, it actually changes the genetic code of the organism before we detect it, which for scientists is a crazy thing to do. But we do change that 4-letter alphabet to a 3-letter alphabet. So we convert all those C letters, they're the cytosines, and we change them to a T letter. That gives us really two advantages. I'll tell you two. The first is that the 3-base method is inherently resistant to most genetic mutations because it's that C letter that we change. That's the most unstable DNA letter in nature. It spontaneously converts to T naturally, and it's 140 times more likely to do that in the viral target, such as SARS-CoV-2. So as a consequence, our tests are resistant to over half of the mutations that occur naturally, particularly relevant with SARS-CoV-2. And I should just say that our test, we do have a test for SARS-CoV-2. It's able to detect all variants, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc. And we are a 99% perfect match to the sequences. The second advantage is that our technology allows us to screen for a large number of organisms effectively from the one patient sample. So these are called syndromic panels. So you have symptoms and we can look for a really broad range of clinically relevant pathogens. And I guess the relevant example is that someone presents with respiratory symptoms. They've got a sore throat, runny nose, could be influenza, it could be rhinovirus, could be RSV, or it could be SARS-CoV-2. But our tests that we make are able to look for all of these and more. As I said, effectively one test in the one patient sample. And I'll just finish by saying that the IP for our 3-base technology is valid till at least the year 2031.
2031.
2031.
Great.
At least, yeah.
Okay, thanks, John. And your technology has resulted in many diagnostic products across a broad range of indications, including gastrointestinal infections, antimicrobial resistance, meningitis, and respiratory, most recently COVID-19. When you look back over your journey, what 2 or 3 milestones have been largely responsible for the company's success?
I'll see if I can give you 3. Obviously, the discovery of the 3-base method was the significant milestone, but also the ability to fund that development. And that was really done through private equity. Very early on, one of the first trials we ever did in New South Wales, we found a hypervirulent strain of Clostridium difficile. It's a gastrointestinal bacteria. It has a mortality rate of over 20% if you're elderly and captured in hospital. That's incredibly high. And prior to the study we did, it was thought it didn't exist in New South Wales. It was something that was in North America. But the discovery led to our development of our complete bacterial panel. So we added 5 additional bacterial targets to that panel and then developed the viral, the protozoan, and then all of the panels that you just mentioned. So that was really very critical for our success. The second milestone is really our investment that we made in automation, and that started 8 years ago. So we developed very efficient, high throughput, automated workflows. And that allows a testing laboratory to process hundreds and thousands, I can now say 10,000 patient samples in a given day. And it's led to 3 genetic signatures branded instruments. So we have low throughput, mid throughput, high throughput. And really the significance of this for investors and shareholders is that each of these instruments is revenue generating. And we've quadrupled the instruments that we have in the field over the last 18 months. The third milestone, I guess, is somewhat related, but it was really the capital raise that we completed at the end of 2019. It was for 37.5 million. It really put us in an excellent position to respond to what was then the emerging pandemic. So we developed, validated, and sold test kits as early as March of 2020. And that's really significant. I just learned recently that one of our sites has tested almost 900,000 patient specimens for SARS-CoV-2 with our 3-base technology over the last 18 months. And that's really part of what drove the substantial sales growth that we've seen. We just reported a over $28 million financial year, maiden full year profit. And in context, it was less than 5 million only 2 years ago.
Oh, well done. Now, you mentioned field. So is that, you've got point of care products as well?
No, when I say in the field, I mean that they're our testing labs. So
testing labs.
So we don't do the tests ourselves. We sell the tests to labs who have our instruments or their own instruments. We do work on third-party instruments, but our instruments have a very nice workflow.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. And what areas of product development are you currently working on that may deliver another such milestone success?
We've recently announced to the market that we are continuing that investment in hardware and automation. So we are developing a 3-base specific instrument. It's a sample to answer instrument, and it will dramatically reduce the hands-on time and preparation time that lab staff need to perform these tests. In addition to that, we've recently announced 3 new screening panels. We hadn't announced these until just a few weeks ago, but they cover tick-borne infections. So you may have heard of Lyme disease. They cover measles, mumps, rubella, which are vaccine preventable, but we've just talked about vaccine hesitancy. So these have really started to come up again. And dermatophytes, which are fungal infections of the skin and nails, and they can take weeks to diagnose. But it's really important when you think of it from a genetic signatures point of view, that our revenue that I just told you about is predominantly from the 2 most mature products. And that's respiratory, which has been fueled somewhat by the pandemic, gastrointestinal, which is our most mature product. So the kits I just mentioned and others, we have 7 more coming through, either through the regulatory registrations or development pathways. And these tests work in exactly the same way as the tests that are already in use in the field. And that's why we're very excited to complete that development and the commercialization of these new products. It's probably important to say that I'm most excited about our first FDA cleared product. So that we're actually going through the clinical trials required to support that application right now, Matt. We've modeled that product alone could generate over $80 million worth of annual revenue for us, depending on final price and market penetration. But we need to get through the FDA process, which would be a very significant milestone for us.
Well, good luck with that. And what developments in the market do you see creating opportunities for genetic signatures and or possible headwinds?
I think we should focus probably on the market for infectious diseases, the diagnostic, because that's really the topical. The current situation where the majority of respiratory specimens are tested for SARS-CoV-2 only is a very short-term strategy. So it will get us through the pandemic, and that's the main goal. It has a high mortality rate compared to other respiratory viruses. But testing for COVID only has to stop soon at some point, and that's our opportunity. Genetic Signatures has developed that broad screen for respiratory infections. We've got regulatory registrations for those kits in Europe and Australia. It's probably easiest to think of that symptomatic person, probably people listening have symptoms. They go for a test, it's COVID only. They're told they don't have COVID, but they still feel lousy. And it's completely natural for them to think, well, look, what if that test didn't work? Maybe I should go back for another. But by including additional targets, it's reassuring to be told, you have rhinovirus. It's the common cold, sort of isolate, but you'll be better in a few days. And that's the reason we're excited. Those kits are ready to go. We've quadrupled the instruments in the field, as I said, and we are really well placed to leverage those 2 things to expand the testing market in a high throughput environment. And I'll just add briefly that there's not a lot of other companies that have that broad respiratory screen. It's where Genetic Signatures excels. It's where 3-base helps us to look for multiple targets in that one patient sample, all of which have very similar symptoms to each other.
Thanks for that, John. Now, Paul, similar to John, for anyone not familiar with the Avecho's TPM technology, can you briefly describe it and its applications?
Sure. Firstly, again, Matt, thanks for having me also. So look, Avecho's TPM is essentially a proprietary drug delivery technology which is derived from vitamin E. So the founding IP of the company was really a manufacturing process that takes natural vitamin E and turns it into 2 different forms of phosphorylated vitamin E. This is the mixture that we call TPM. Now, we'd originally developed it as an enhanced form of vitamin E because it has a whole lot of interesting improved biological properties compared to natural tocopherol. But during that process, we did notice that because we put this phosphate group on the end, suddenly this TPM would self-assemble into nanoparticles. And so these nanoparticles are about the size of a liposome. They're less than the width of a human hair, so about 120 to 150 nanometers in diameter. And they, importantly, like a liposome, encapsulate drug. And so we started to play around with those, and we showed that when we use these vesicles in encapsulated drug, we could increase oral bioavailability, which is essentially the percentage of drug absorbed into your systemic circulation when you take an oral tablet or a capsule. We could also develop topical and transdermal dosage forms, so gels, creams, and patches, where the TPM enhanced the amount of drug that was passing through the skin. And we could also increase drug solubility, which is an issue for injectable dosage forms, where, when you're injecting something, it really needs to be in an aqueous, a water-based vehicle, and a lot of drugs aren't soluble in water. So injectable dosage forms quite often come with detergents or quite nasty organic solvents to get the drug into the dosage form. And so we've essentially been using a form of vitamin E to try and replace those to make a safer example. Now, once we noticed we could do this kind of positive things to drugs, we started our journey on really being a biotech that was reformulating drug products. So we were essentially looking at drugs that were coming off patent or drugs that were on market that had technical deficiencies. So that might be poor absorption or adverse side effects. And we went through the process in Melbourne, a facility in Clayton, to reformulate the product, maximize its performance. And then we would go through the steps down into clinical trials to really prove that we had successfully achieved the differentiation that we're after. And so an example of this would be Voltaren Emerald Gel. So everyone knows Novartis's Voltaren product. I mean, we built a formulation from scratch using our tech. We did all the work in-house to show that we had increased drug absorption when compared to Novartis's product. We did clinical trials to show the increased drug absorption in humans. And then that product was subsequently licensed to a larger Indian pharmaceutical company who sub-licensed it back to Novartis. And now it's on market in a couple of countries in Asia and going through more as we speak. And so we've really learned a lot in the biotech space about how to make drugs perform better, and now turning our attention, I guess, to the new field, which is medicinal cannabis.
Thanks for that, Paul. And declaring my conflict here as I'm a director of ECHO, why should our audience pay particular attention to the use of TPM in cannabidiol products?
So this will be a longer answer because there's so many things that the tech adds a lot of value to. And so, I mean, you start with what's wrong with the cannabinoids. And so, I mean, our last 15 years of formulating a whole different kind of dosage forms and different drugs with different classes and different chemistries is that we understand what kind of molecule plugs in perfectly to our technology. And so if you had to describe it, you would say a lipid-soluble molecule with poor oral bioavailability. And that essentially describes medicinal cannabis and the cannabinoid molecules. So CBD itself, which is now ubiquitous around the world, has very, very poor oral bioavailability. So depending on the trial data that you read, only 3 to 8% of CBD is actually absorbed into systemic circulation. So 90% is metabolized and or excreted. So that's a real issue for the dosage forms, the CBD dosage forms that are currently on market. These dosage forms themselves are pretty crude. So especially in the medicinal cannabis space in Australia, where the market has been serviced by the special access scheme that allows you to prescribe unapproved medicines. When you can prescribe unapproved medicines, why would you do clinical trials and formulation development? Because that all comes with cost and time. And so the products that are all mostly sold under SASB are pretty simple oil formulations. And so moving forward, we kind of feel that patients in the future in the pharmaceutical space are going to need more pharmaceutically appropriate dosage forms. So tablets, capsules, patches, these kind of things. And the other piece is that CBD comes with a real lack of quality data. Again, when you can sell it immediately as an unapproved medicine and you don't need to generate data to prove it works, no one's paying for data to prove it works. So consequently, it's the first time that, medicines are being prescribed to patients that don't come with a safety and efficacy dossier. And so physicians really know how they should be prescribing it. And so these three things together are really what we do day to day for other drugs. And given there are real lack and absence in the medicinal cannabis space, we kind of took it upon ourselves to develop, pharmaceutical forms of CBD that you can register with the TGA and the FDA that come with safety and efficacy and are proven to work. Now, the other piece there is that there's no differentiation in the CBD space. Again, they're all pretty simple dosage forms. They're really not that different to each other. There's now, I think it's 150 medicinal cannabis products under SASB. And apart from a couple of ratio changes with respect to CBD and THC, and some dosage forms, there's little in the way of differentiation. So everyone's looking for what the next generation of products will be. And so we essentially see ourselves as one of those. And so we spent last year optimizing a new formulation. So we optimized in Denmark the ratio of our TPM to CBD to some other carrier oils to really maximize the amount of CBD that would be absorbed from an oral dose. And the animal studies that we did showed a 40 times increase in absorption of CBD compared to the comparator that most patients are eating in Australia right now. Now, we'd been talking to medicinal cannabis companies that believed if we saw a 10 or a 20% increase in absorption, that would be suddenly a physician-preferred formulation. And so a 40 times increase was, spectacular result for us. I'm very careful to caveat it that it's an animal study. There's no guarantee we'd see a 40 times increase in people, but even if we see 5 times, 2 times, it's still a great product advantage. And so we're taking this product forwards towards registration in Australia under the new S3 category. So S3, what happened late last year, again, it's all kind of perfectly timed for us, is the TGA downscheduled CBD. So moving forward, CBD can be registered with the TGA as an over-the-counter medicine. Now, that means you don't need to go get a script from an authorized prescriber. You don't need to operate under SASB. You can walk into any chemist and buy your CBD on the proviso that it's registered with the TGA, which means you've demonstrated it works with clinical trials for a given indication and that it's safe, and it can only have a maximal daily dose of 150 milligrams, which is still not a high dose of CBD. So this opportunity with the TGA leverages itself perfectly for a product with increased bioavailability that has clinical trial support in a pharmaceutical dosage format. So we've made a soft gel. So it's perfect for us. And the last piece to, I guess, finish off your question, Matt, this is the first time we've ever looked at a drug. Routinely, we look at a drug and we know we have to take it all the way to registration and then license it to Big Pharma. And once it's commercialized, we'll start getting royalties and revenue and all these kind of things. This is the first drug that, whilst we're running towards pharmaceutical development, we can sell it, the exact same product with the same differentiation into the food space in the UK and the medicinal market in Germany and the wellness space in the United States, and start carving off and licensing it for separate indications. So there's opportunities to get revenue from this same product immediately, instead of waiting, the number of years until it's approved with the TGA. So we're trying to explore all these avenues at once in order just to really maximize the value that we get out of the product.
And so what does the clinical program look like, and when can investors expect to see the results of these trials?
So the clinical trial, if I look at my clock, I think dosing is 1 month from today. So the first clinical trial that we're doing is a phase 1 PK study. Again, we're doing it very rigorously. We see this phase 1 PK study as the first part of a product label and an invaluable part of, obviously, a TGA submission. You've got to characterize your drug absorption. Physicians need to know what the delivery profile looks like. And so yeah, I think we start recruiting next week. The product, which I haven't touched upon, we'd optimize the formulation and then contracted Catalent in the United States to take our oil product with optimal absorption and package it into a soft gel capsule. So this study has taken longer to kick off than we anticipated earlier in the year, simply because when the TGA opportunity came around, we knew we needed to get the dosage form as finished as possible prior to starting clinical trials, so that we knew that the data was on the finished dosage form and the data would count. So we've spent the last 6 months with Catalent really finalizing this formulation, pilot scale manufacturing, all this kind of stuff was made. The GMP batch was made a couple of weeks ago. I think it jumps on a plane in week after next. As I say, we dose patients walk into the clinic end of September, dose start of October. They'll be dosed twice in the first 2 weeks of October and bled to really characterize the absorption profile from our product. We ship the bloods off to Canada, they get analysed, and we would really hope at this stage that we get high-level results very beginning of December. So it'll be a really big couple of months. We've got a lot of overseas interest in the product, but everyone's impressed by the animal data. Everyone needs to see how it performs in people before they get really excited and determine if the product is for them.
Yeah, but that's pretty quick, so that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, while we're doing that, we're obviously looking forward to the clinical efficacy program that goes into the registration. I mean, we've targeted sleep as the first indication. So I guess the other thing about this over-the-counter medicine is it has to have an indication that patients can self-diagnose. So, and is not so serious that it needs medical intervention. So, it's some sleep indications, some anxiety indications, some pain indications. We're starting with sleep. And I think I've actually got a meeting this afternoon to talk about the phase 3 development program. And so when that's locked in stone, we'll obviously be able to update the market around that as well.
Great. Thanks for that, Paul. Now, Michael, capital raisings, including IPOs, are still attracting investor attention. Clarity was a successful one recently. What are some of the more interesting plays that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly the last 18 months has really highlighted the strategic value of having access to the public capital markets. I think we've seen a huge number of companies come to the ASX looking for that access over that time. The ASX has revealed they listed more companies in over that period than they've ever done in a 12-month period before.
Is that right?
So there's a lot of IPOs out there, but I think in the last really 5-6 months, the investors are getting a little bit, fatigued about the new IPO stories and becoming a lot more selective, both on the quality of the management team, the quality of the story, and the pricing. So I think good companies are still getting listed, but some of the froth, so to speak, has come out. And I think, though, more relevant to this call, the medtech sector, I think, over the last 18 months has really highlighted to a broader investor community just how defensive it is versus many other sectors. Even sectors like real estate, people have suddenly understood that there are significant strategic risks that they probably hadn't appreciated in commercial real estate, for example. But medtech, it's an absolute essential. It's generally inflation and economic condition defensive. They're generally speaking global asset classes. May have a lot of barriers to competition, and if you're well equipped to assess the risk of an earlier stage company or a latter stage company's competition, really a potentially great source of value creation. But being so remote, I think there's a lot of fear still in the market because Australia's so far from the European or US markets that investors really struggle a little bit with assessing just how novel a medical device or therapeutic or diagnostic technology is when they don't have the visibility of what's going on directly. And I suppose, to be honest, I didn't intend this to be a plug for Horizon or for Newburyport, but I think that's where some sort of more expert due diligence and an understanding of the broader market really adds a lot of value
So what is the outlook for the balance of the calendar year, and importantly, the key risks from Newburyport's perspective?
Well, I think that the biggest risk is just what shape a reopening takes for the economy. It does play out. We saw the worst ever auction clearance rates several weeks ago when lockdown was extended in Victoria, and that just shows how sentiment driven the market is at the moment around the light at the end of the tunnel, which I think we're all sort of seeing. And Victoria's adopted a more rational policy, and I think we're seeing a lot more positive sentiment coming out of that. So I think we could finish the year really strongly. But equally, a lack of clarity around what the future looks like for Victoria and international opening up is creating headwinds. And I'm certainly involved in several companies where business development activities, clinical trial activity, or even exit discussions have been delayed simply because we're locked into this country and travel restrictions are onerous that engagement with the rest of the world is becoming more and more challenging.
And Michael, finally, when we get industry advisors on, we always like to pick your brains. Apart from genetic signatures and Avecho, can you give the audience a couple of key picks from your perspective?
Well, yeah, I mean, my sense of it is that the reality is the pandemic has made everyone a little bit more focused on the medtech sector than they were before. Everyone understands what a PCR test is, or what epidemiology is, and so I think there's a lot more attention there. And the other factors that I think people have suddenly realised is there's a lot of there's going to be a growing wave of latter stage cancer diagnostics and mental health, which is going to highlight the value of screening to detect these things. So I'd be saying mental health and cancer are obviously key sectors I like, but also earlier sort of it plays out into the general earlier disease diagnosis or more rapid screening for therapeutic candidates that could treat diseases that are novel. So those are the sectors that I like. I'd hesitate to give too many tips on individual companies, but there's several companies in Australia that really demonstrate great platform technologies, and Avecho is a great example in genetic signatures that that there's great, I guess, positive sentiment around the ability of those companies to be more nimble. Although I would ask a bit of a question about, given the reliance on PCR in Australia, why that's the case when there's obviously much better solutions available. So it'd be interesting to explore perhaps a little bit of a question around that to genetic signatures in terms of how nimble the regulatory can be versus the scientific. But beyond that, I think given the more selective nature of and the limited IPOs out there, I think there's a really interesting play in the pre-IPO space, where there's a lot of interesting companies, really creating a lot of value and developing well. So, I'd be highlighting to individuals that can to look at the pre-IPO space as well.
All right, thanks for that. John might be able to answer that. There are a few questions from the audience, and I'll just remind all the other attendees, if you hit your Q&A button down the bottom, you can submit a question. So I'll start with, there's 3 questions to John. So first one is, can your product test for resistant bacterial strains of all bacteria, thereby avoiding the need to do a culture test to test for antibiotic sensitivity?
Good question. I didn't have time to go into it, but one of the products that we actually have regulatory registration for in Europe and Australia is an antibiotic resistant bacterial test. So we look for ESBL, extended spectrum beta lactamases, and the CPOs, carbapenemase producing organisms. And that is something, as I said, we are excited about, because it has been modeled that death from antibiotic resistant bacteria will exceed those cancer deaths by the year 2050. So that's really a frightening statistic, that there will be bacteria that we can't treat that will lead to death. So we're certainly proud of the fact that we've developed a kit that can detect 2 of those main classes, and we will always look to see other types of resistant markers that we can add to our product portfolio.
And June, this is for you, John. Timeline on FDA process?
Yeah, timeline. We're in the midst of the trials now. We're targeting finishing those trials by the end of the year, but the trial has had a couple of bumps along the way, primarily due to the pandemic. So first of all, in the early part of the pandemic, labs were not able to dedicate the time to do the trials. And then as we've gone through with lockdowns, remembering it's a trial for gastroenteritis and protozoans, which really come from contaminated water, contaminated food. So lockdown has really reduced the number of cases that we're seeing. So depending on recruitment, we are targeting by the end of the year for submission. There may be a bit of creep depending on patient recruitment. And then the FDA have about, we're expecting 3 to 6 month review process.
Right. Okay. And this next question, I suspect it's from one of my colleagues. I'm on the board of Microbio, which has got a rapid sepsis testing technology. I don't know if you know about that. You do, John. So this person has asked, will you consider development in sepsis?
Certainly sepsis has been considered. The key for sepsis is a really quick result. And obviously, you know that, Matt. So I guess this ties into that new instrument that we're looking at developing and new technologies that we haven't actually spoken about, which will generate results in well under an hour. And in that context, I think 3-base really has an application for sepsis, even if it's just gram positive versus gram negative, which is an assay we worked up 15 years ago. Absolutely. In our product development, I just can't give any timings of that just yet.
Okay, that's great. Now, I don't think there's any more questions, and we are coming to the end of not regular time, so we'll wind it up now. The next webinar will be Thursday, the 7th of October at our 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time start. Thank you to the audience. Your feedback and suggestions are most welcome. Our thanks go to FB Rights and Monsoon Communications for sponsoring and hosting this webinar. And finally, thank you again to John, Michael and Paul for joining us. See you all again soon. And on behalf of the Horizon 3 Biotech team, goodbye, good investing, and stay safe and stay sane in lockdown. Thank you, guys. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Until next time. Bye.
Thanks so much, Matt.